good afternoon, and I know it's been kind of an invigorating morning with getting to spend the morning with students over at Northwood in that really a beautiful facility. Every time I go over there, I'm just so thrilled that I did get to school. Such a fantastic facility. But all of our facilities are great as well. So we're back to continue our discussion regarding strategic planning process, theory of action kinds of conversation, looking at Vision 2020, if that is our decision, our vision, and Harriet is here to guide us through some further conversation as, again, we work towards that June workshop. We're scheduled from 12 till 3 with a hard stop at 3. And any questions before we get started? Okay, I will turn it over to
Oh, I have one. How do you want to do lunch?
Right, now that it's here, do you want to just
You want to go
get
grab
your
lunch
lunch
and
now,
get
and then-
eating, and then while you're eating, I can kind of open up with kind of talking about our day a little bit, and then how's that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you. Grab some lunch. Do you need a pen, please? No.
There's no cancer causation. Thank you, Carol.
Blue one is fast. I was trying to say thank you. She does cool. They all do.
David, do you have food? All right. Good. Well, I will, I'll just kind of do a little preamble here, tell you how happy I am to be back. I really get hooked to be with you this morning. And I thought I had it all organized so that I could just kind of share that experience with people being in the classrooms. And with sick dog and papers not yet graded, I made the decision that I'm going to be at home. So I can tell by your energy that you had a great morning, and it's good. So I thought, well, our big purpose today that Donna and I were talking about is really to focus in on Vision 2020 and to decide why, what, and how that might be updated if in fact you want to do so. So I think that whole question is still on the table, and I'm hoping that by the end of the day, you will at least be at a point where you can say, we think we know. Is anybody hearing any weird noises?
Yes, there's a backup.
Thank you. They come through strangely in my hearing. but really to decide if that is a direction you want to take, and then if so, what does that mean for the June retreat? So kind of moving and kind of planning to plan a little bit.
Just for clarity,
Yes.
I missed what the verb was that you used when you said, is it revisit 2020, or what was it? If we wanted to
Updated.
change, update?
Well, yeah, yes, and it's complete, yeah.
So it's update was the term,
Update.
okay.
Update, revisit, revise, refine.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, so knowing that 2020 is kind of right around the corner, so. I also went back in thinking about today and kind of looked at where we started in our work together when we met. So we met, Tracy and David and Donna and I met in November and kind of talked about what we thought we needed as a board with 2 new members coming in and really thinking about how to cement and become that governing board with onboarding. So when we spent in January, and our purpose then was really to start to develop strong relationships, productive processes, learn each other, and in the process, I'm learning all of you as well. And then I think one of the things that was very important, especially to David, is to figure out what strategic work, particularly strategic conversation, looks like, so that as a board you can really help each other stay at that level of conversation that's strategic and governing. So in January, we spent some time getting to know each other's values and why you're here, volunteering your time. We did some opening, kind of where do you stand right now on where's our own strengths and opportunities. And remember, we did the sticky chart and the dots, and you kind of weighed in on what you thought were the highest priorities. And I have copies of these if you want to remember. This was your initial kind of, again, learning each other, what you had in common and where you saw things slightly differently. So we also went through and determined what you thought the attributes of a strategic conversation were, and we had one. Kind of learned by doing and figured out what are some of those benchmarks and criteria. So that is our list up there. And then we learned from Donna about what we call the state of the system. And she and I kind of did a fishbowl conversation, and we took advantage of the fresh eyes on your system of somebody who's now seen it from classroom to board and is able to step back and say, this is what I'm seeing is happening, this is what I'm seeing is not happening, but really had the benefit of that before. As I told her, I said, you'll get sucked into the system and then you will become a part of it, you won't be able to see it anymore. So let's use this opportunity to really share this with the board. So, and then we met again in March. And we brought in the idea of a framework, because that led us to, okay, so what do you want to do about 2020? Do you want to do anything? So we brought in the idea of a framework as a way to help you think about the organization as a whole, help you think about how stakeholders fit into, how different departments fit into some kind of an organizational strategy, which is generally what constitutes a strategic plan. So that was our last conversation. I think we would all say that, most of us would say that it was frustrating to many of you, that it felt like we didn't really get anywhere at the end of that. And I think one of the things I took away was that you like to do your homework in advance. You are a very prepared board. And I kind of knew that, but I underestimated the extent of your commitment, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. So that brings us to today. And kind of, so I have today organized in basically 3 parts. John and I have spent several sessions really talking about. Really hoping that, as I said, hoping that by the end of today, you have a collective not a decision, but understanding of what you need to do with 2020 information. We're going to start off with the why conversation. Kind of why might you need to update Vision 2020? Talking about how it might advantage the district. I know you were sent a copy of a strategic planning process that took place in Sioux Falls, and I do have fresh copies here if you'd like them. We're not going to do a text study on this because I assume you've all had an opportunity to go through it. But I want it's background information for your thinking about the ways in which strategic plans can advantage a district, and for you to think about how 2020 operates. Okay. And then we'll move to the what, and this is where we're going to engage Jennifer and you in a conversation about Jennifer, we're going to engage you in a conversation. Right. I want to really hear from the staff perspective on where do we see 2020 in classrooms, and any strategic plan, any strategy. You want to see the will of the board in the classroom. That's where your work matters, and I know all of you understand that and work with that idea every single day. So we're going to talk about that and spend a good chunk of time and really talk about where we see Vision 2020 in action. And then the last section will be kind of, okay, what do you want to do? Are we good where we are now? Are there things that we want to adjust, and what does that mean for you? So, you know, why, what, and how. So I'll stop there for a minute and ask about questions, additions, other things you'd like to be talking about today, other interpretations of what we've been doing up to now.
So I will say, I think this is a good direction to be going in. I think we do need to, as a board, understand if our vision needs to be updated or refreshed. It's been a long time since we have changed anything there, other than occasional wordsmithing along the way.
That is fundamental.
Yeah, but 1 through 5 has been, you know, I think we added leadership. We added 1 or 2 other things in a slight change of way. And even I think the diversity fundamental, you know, it's been 2 years. We didn't ever get things exactly right the first time. So I think there's an opportunity to think about that also, in terms of what differences are we making in the classroom, I like your term, Harriet, with these fundamentals. How are they changing what happens in the classroom? And I think that's a good opportunity to talk about. I think Brian, Donna, and I, even on the diversity fundamental, we're not changing diversity in our classroom. Diversity is what is thrown at us. And really what we're trying to achieve, I think Donna put it very nicely, is we're trying to achieve equity for the students in the classroom. So even that has a fundamental opportunity to be refreshed in a kind of more thoughtful way that I think has relevance worthy of discussion. So I like what we're trying to do. I think we are thinking about it from a board perspective first, which is good because it helps us bring some clarity around where we like feedback, where we don't need feedback. It gives people a way to channel feedback. We did ask people for feedback, and you know, giving them nothing to react to, we didn't get a lot of feedback. So I think there is opportunity here for us to give people something to react to. So I like that as well. Same as Chris Rykadel gave us his strategy discussion with things to pick that we thought were important as school board members. So I like the direction we're going in, so I'll voice my support around this.
Hey, Frank.
Hi there. Sorry, I got sucked into a project that I was just lost track of time. I was working away in my office on a great
Nobody
project.
here has ever had that happen. So, other thoughts on kind of actually moving into this conversation? So coming around is Vision 2020. And the fundamentals and the vision and the mission. Do you want to put this one?
I think we can just sort of
Okay.
at this point.
So, let's just take a look. I mean, I'm sure this is ingrained in your brain, but,
You all have it memorized, right?
really, but the questions we're really asking here was, why might we need to update Vision 2020? What would we hope to gain from that? How would that be a good thing for the district?
For me, and I think that our reading homework helped to kind of focus that and put that in perspective as well. And the two pieces from the Phelps program that we saw to this piece here really showed the superintendent leading that process of the different focus groups and different study groups and everything that go into it, which then informs the board with that overarching policy to say, okay, so maybe we do need to move, maybe we do need to shift. And so getting used to that through our governance process here. We just reviewed 2 more fundamentals, found compliance on that within the board. And we're seeing that qualitative and quantitative data that's going to show that compliance. And then we see in those meetings, that's where I'm seeing us having strategies in those meetings when we're asking those additional questions around it. Or could we get a little more data here, or maybe I'm not seeing something here, and these little things come up. And so all of this together kind of led me to think, so we've got this overarching kind of review that we're constantly doing as a board on the fundamentals and the policies. And we're getting that data coming up to us. So I could see us as a board moving in a strategic way to have deeper conversations around those fundamental presentations. With us saying, so did this qualitative data and quantitative data, did it really inform us well? There's a lot of data here, but what sections of it maybe aren't as necessary for the board? That came up at our last board meeting, was the, which points would you share with us that maybe it's too much information, or, so to understand, how is this serving? And then for the superintendent to present to us, is this really moving down to every individual classroom, every student? Are these fundamentals still serving the purpose they were intended to? And let that bounce back up to us as a board. And if that answer is not so much, it's, this fundamental has become a little bit more stagnant, or this piece of policy isn't quite fitting our culture anymore, I think that informs us up here at this higher strategic level as to where we need to be moving with the ship. But always being informed by those subject matter experts within the district who really see this on a regular, everyday system, how it's impacting students. Does that make sense?
So I have a question. When you get your fundamental and you do, you review 2 fundamentals, so what you learn from that is how the fundamentals are impacting students? Is that the? Okay.
We receive qualitative and quantitative data, and then that's presented through principals across the school district and central office that really break that out. And they show those high points, so we read the packet ahead of time. We might have a question, I've noticed this percentage dropping off, or we noticed this percentage has jumped up, or this seems really low. Can you tell me more about that? And then we find out, we've identified these areas that we want to grow, which kind of sets a soft goal to be observing. So if you're tracking that, then we kind of know where we're headed. But one thing, and I use the term stress test. My father was a fire inspector, And so I use that, let's stress the pipes, let's stress the system a little bit and see where those leaks are, or, so I kind of look at it that way. This quantitative data is bubbling up, really is showing us where those numbers are shifting within demographic groups and the student responses and parent responses and faculty responses. Do you feel that you're getting enough support here in this area? And if you see that low number, then you have those questions to say, so how is this fundamental fostering, developing that piece over here? Is it possible to do that within this fundamental, or is that something new that needs to be brought in? Is that a culture shift? So I think, and I've only just begun, Deborah and I, we're only 6 months into it now. But I'm beginning to see that trend happening. And then the following week, we talk about the language of that fundamental and those goals. What is it? That's how leadership came in last year. So we have a structure, a framework, a scaffolding around that of how this board is regularly doing that work. And I think that's a positive thing. So I'm wondering if maybe it's within our regular board meetings, following up and having a little bit deeper conversation with the board of saying, so, you know, is the data serving? Are you getting enough information here to really serve your questions around this? Or is this scaffolding just not serving us in that manner to really constantly check whether or not these systems are working?
So I've been struggling with this a bit, and tell me if I get too far ahead. On the one hand, I've been really getting to know the fundamentals and hearing about it. To me, when I read them, it's a good thing and a bad thing. I think you could fit anything in it. Anything and everything, frankly, which is a good thing. But then I also think, what purpose is it serving? If we can, we know, I mean, we know what our values are, we know what our vision is, we know what where we want our students to be. Fundamentals help them get there. It's what I struggle with. I don't know. Part of me says, what's the point? Because anything we do fits in them. And then part of me says, well, of course we want everything to fit in them, right? So that's just what I've been struggling with on them. Because to spend a lot of time, you know, on word choice and adding a word and, you know, at least in the beginning, I'm sure it was really important. But at this point, to me, that's busy work at this point, because I think they're very inclusive of everything, like I said, which is a positive in a lot of ways. So,
Are you saying they don't establish a priority?
They don't establish a priority.
Is that what you're saying?
I think maybe it's, for me, for goals, I know this is a vision and not goals, but.
But this is what you measure, right?
Right. It's what we measure, which is what I have a hard time in our meetings when we're measuring the fundamentals is, you know, you present anything that you do and then it's there, right? But are we serving our students in the best way possible? And how can we have either vision or goals that is, you know, where we're making sure everything is at least attempting to achieve at the highest level. And then, so, a lot of it is this governance model that I struggle with of we're evaluating ourselves, which to me doesn't make any sense. So it's just, these are kind of the struggles that I've had.
Wait, say more about that.
So as with the governance model we find ourselves in compliance.
Yeah.
That's very strange to me. That, I mean, we should have a self-evaluation, but, and we find the district in compliance, but there's been things where we've found the board in compliance.
And you have,
Board behavior.
Right. But, I mean, that's odd to me. And then, but also, yes, we find the district in compliance. I mean, I guess historically, has the district ever been found not in compliance?
No, never.
So,
Well,
yes.
sections of it, haven't there been
So the
individual?
board of, as far as the fundamentals go, never.
Right,
they've
but on
always
the board report,
On the
there's been
board
sections.
side, that's a different thing, yeah.
So how is that useful if there's never, I mean, we, you know, as great as we are, or as great as our district is, come on, nothing's perfect, and there's always room for improvement. So what purpose is that serving? I mean, we're learning about things that are happening in the district, which is great. And then to be able to have conversations and tweak it and deeper learning, that part of it is fantastic. I don't understand what we're getting out of the compliance and,
I think, in some ways, yeah, we don't want to feel like we're useless or overstaffed. But at the same time, if we weren't doing compliance, there would be a less likely chance of us meeting those kinds of standards. So if we stop doing it, say, then there's less motivation to be as great in the district potentially.
right, and I think there's a middle ground of what you just said, which I don't disagree with at all. And then what Brian said is there a different way that we can present this?
Yeah, and I'm happy to discover
Yeah.
new ways to do it, but I
Can you
don't
have
think-
both? Can you have compliance and can you have growth goals? I mean, I think that's
Right.
Well,
kind of
and
what
I think that's what we do, and we do hear about when principals will say, you know, we were working on this goal and we fell short. And we do hear about that, and there's a lot of self-reflection, the body of administrators saying we need to improve on this or that. That doesn't mean they're not in compliance for making the effort enough to have self-reflection. So I don't think we just hear like rose-colored glasses, everything's good, therefore they're in compliance. I feel like we are hearing the self-criticism that principals will have about their own system and the district will have about their own system, but at the same time, overall, we approve for compliance because
It's part of your
it's
job.
pretty good here.
Well, part of your job is
It's
not.
legal
So,
requirement.
Ralph and then Brian.
So, I'll address a couple things that came up, but also just make a couple statements. The compliance, I get it, I think it is kind of quirky. We're not failing ourselves. But I think we also need to keep in mind, it's that public board meeting, that we are, you know, having these meetings in the public, and we need to be positive, we need to be forward-looking, and also be a safe place for principals and teachers to come up and say, you know, we fell short here, but this is what we're going to be working on. So I think given the uniqueness of a public entity, the compliance, I get. And I think if we continue to have it be a safe environment and forward-thinking, then I think the more people participating in those reviews can be more open and honest for the ultimate benefit of the kids and delivering education to the students.
So can we clarify what I think I heard is that the kind of a compliance mode where we're making sure that we're meeting these standards, and we do, that creates public confidence in the school district, and it allows people to feel safe in their daily work, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and there is a threshold. I think if we were failing something, I don't think anybody here would have a problem saying we were not in compliance. But I think in practice, we've seen, you know, very good efforts and very good results. I am happy that the board itself does evaluate itself on its behavior, on its conflict of interest. I wish actually more public entities did that. I think they would eliminate a lot of mistrust that sometimes the public has with public entities. And I think we hold ourselves accountable very well, and I think through that process, we engender the public trust and keep ourselves from, you know, doing self-inflicted wounds. stepping backward or stepping sideways. So I'm all for that. I also think doing the compliance is also a process for us, essentially continually reviewing the superintendent, so that it's a thoughtful, year-round approach, as opposed to a rushed approach done in May and done in December. This way we can kind of look at the holistic of the system and stuff. And also keep in mind that we're reviewing, the compliance is the review of our overall goals that we've set aside. And that's really how we should be holding the superintendent accountable for the goals that we set forward. I get the comment that they're very inclusive, they're very wordy. And towards that end, they're not very focused, and maybe that's the thing, is maybe we can have a short-term focused thing. I would hate to remove ones, because I think they're all very important. To the extent it doesn't create a 60-second elevator pitch to educators, I get that. You know, I appreciate that maybe we want to create a 60-second elevator pitch that summarizes that we can kind of say what our fundamentals are about. But with that elevator pitch, usually you have a business plan that backs it up. And to me, that fundamental thing is the business plan. Sound like a broken record. I'd love to hear the history and the processes that went into the Vision 2020. If we're considering having the superintendent change it or ourselves change it, I think we should at least appreciate the history that went into it. And at some point, have a critical review of the 2020, of what people like, what people dislike about it, if we're considering changing it. And likewise, I think at a certain point, we need to figure out, is this the superintendent's responsibility to tell us that it needs to be changed, or is this for us to say it needs to be changed?
So building on that, and in response to Deborah, yeah, it's wordy, these are really broad, and I've heard Donna say it's, you know, a mile long and an inch deep. So we want more depth into it, so maybe shorten it in and create some more depth into what we're doing. Which, you're a new leader, this is where you come from, this is how you work, and this is your vision. This is, you've been in the system for a year now, you now know the community, you have a better sense, a richer sense, and now's the time for you to begin imprinting your stamp on the district, and really what you bring to it. And that's what you were selected to do by 3 of the 5 members of this board. So to that end, yeah, I think that it's gotten into a groove now. I don't know that it's necessarily in a rut yet, but we're heading that way. I think, yes, it's great for protecting the brand and confidence within our district. We want to be positive in our public meetings. We want to point out those positive aspects. I think we also need to be comfortable enough with each other to have courageous conversations where our administrators and our educators and our parents and stakeholders feel that they can come to us with concerns that will be heard, and that we, even though we're on video, have the confidence to share how we're feeling and to really disagree and to call out things that we see in a constructive manner that doesn't damage the district in any way, but shows those individuals, because not everyone is satisfied with it. You know, we do have families and students in the district who would like to see change, who would like that, who aren't feeling fully supported. And so if we're constantly green lighting and finding that compliance, then those families begin to wonder, well, so this is never going to change for me, so this is never going to get better, this is how it is. So I think having those courageous conversations with ourselves, being vulnerable and honest, I think demonstrates that we're willing the five of us to go into depth and really listen to the subject matter experts who are bringing us that data. And then the other piece that I'm kind of missing, because I followed and observed for a year before deciding to actually get onto the board, or try to. And so it's that piece of tracking. So we'll run across a fundamental and a specific percentage will really be down, or we're beginning to notice a bit of a trend in a decline, maybe over a 2 or 3 year span. So it's somehow, for me, would be capturing that, saying, so I would like to see this highlighted, so we remember to really come back to that and really look at that in the next year. So to me, that's a short-term goal, that where we can throw a flag on something in that qualitative, it's the quantitative data, that say, we're not sure what's happening here, we know that you're looking into it and you're trying to pinpoint, what is this? Is it a student cohort thing that's traveling through, or was it an anomaly in this year, or it has something to do with economics, or the opening of a fourth school? But making sure that we come back and really address that when we come back to those fundamentals, or even have a short-term update in 6 months or so, saying, so we looked at that a little bit deeper and looked at that. I don't know, and then there's a lot of pieces that also in the paperwork, the packet for the fundamentals are anywhere from 16 to 20 pages. And some of those points in the qualitative data, you see return. So we're seeing that. And so there's a couple pieces highlighted. And so I've been pulling up past forms and like comparing those. And so how did it change, and did it become more inclusive? So really tracking those trends deeper within that document. But I think that is on the five of us, because that's our job, is to read those documents, to go into depth, to find those spider webs in policy, to circle back a year and 2 years and bring those questions to that meeting to say, so I've noticed this slightly changed here in the language, but we've been doing this for several years and it's constantly being used to support this fundamental. What else can you show that's supporting that? Or, it's great that these clubs, before and after school clubs, are supporting this fundamental. How is this fundamental being supported across all students in the district as part of the regular day? And that's our job, the five of us, to be asking those deeper questions.
So one of my roles as an outsider here is to ask questions. So one of the things that you prompted me to think about is I have heard two different things from this board in terms of, so we're in compliance with our ends and everything, and we're great, and I've also heard that there are things that need attention, that there are priorities. So I've heard both. I'm curious about what it is you're monitoring with the ends. Your end statements are written as activities, not as goal statements. They're not ends, they're activities. Foster, so are you measuring foster, or are you measuring what fostering is supposed to make happen? So and this is a curiosity I have. I have agreed with you that, and probably most of you, that I look at the ends and I'm going, wow, Sarah, these are beautiful. I mean, in terms of what you're asking for students and what you're striving for. And I counted them up, there are 36 data points reflected in those ends. And I'm trying to imagine if you've got 36, and you get summative data, right? You don't get formative data, you get summative data. How you navigate moving growth, pushing growth in the areas where you say we have areas we need to improve in when you're monitoring 36 data points. So sometimes maybe it's the scope of it that, so a couple things. One is you're in compliance, and how does that match with your feelings as a board that there are areas that need attention, that you want to prioritize, and you say, well, social, emotional, or student stress might be in mental health. There were some things that came up last time, right? So how does your compliance with the ends help you start establishing in a governing way the priority and say, this is important to us. This is something we want more data around. This is something we want, not just some of the data, but we want to make this, we want to monitor this so that, because if you get data at the end of every year, so you have these cycles and they're, I mean, the complexity of your system is pretty artful. I mean, it's pretty amazing to look at. Somebody did a lot of work putting this all together. But I'm trying to figure out how, if I was in your seat, I would keep an eye on those things and know that something was happening over the course of a year, because by the time a year's over, if you've got kiddos who are invested, that's a year. So I don't know, Rob.
Yeah, so I have found if I have time, I don't do this all the time, but I'd like to, if I do, go back and look at the previous years or the previous year's review of that fundamental. And it's very enlightening. It helps me as a board member because we have the ability to add additional metrics after we review. And usually when that's done, it's in response to, we'd like this, we're concerned about something like that, or we want to measure that. So that's kind of in a way how the board has placed a little bit of additional emphasis on those fundamentals. We recently talked about, to be fair to the administration, we should probably have them suggest removing some, so we just don't continue to collect. And probably that 36 is a function of this operating for 5 years. So maybe we should try to reduce some down. In terms of the timeliness of the nature, yeah, it's a year before we get it back. But if the board starts clamoring for more frequent updates, we're starting to get into operations too,
Right.
which is a little dangerous. And this is education. So things take time. It's difficult to measure things even on a year basis, let alone more frequently. And then just a random side note, we have this in place and we monitor it. What frustrates me as a metric-oriented person is when you look at standard-based testing, they change the standard every year. And we
It seems like every single
we could ask Jennifer to give us 20 different names of various standards that have come into place over the past 30 years. And it's not the number that we're looking at, it's the trend. And so for a metric in education to be valuable, it needs to be in place for a number of years before we see how we're doing. And so that would be my concern about revisiting the fundamentals. I'd hate to throw the baby out with the bathwater and then start out with a new metric in which we then can't gauge anything accurately for the next 3 years.
Do you expect growth in all 36 areas every year? Is that what you expect as a board?
Yeah. So I have a couple of things on that. One is, with the fundamentals, they set a baseline for our district. I'm super appreciative that we were focused on social emotional learning before all the gun violence type of stuff really hit school districts in a big way. We could say, because of these fundamentals, we've been doing this for years and worried about it for years. So these are general goods that we don't want to have fall behind. I think that's one key thing. I think the second thing is, we say we're in compliance or not. Compliance also allows for successful areas that in general you're maintaining that. And compliance also means that where you've got problems, you're addressing them, not stagnating on them. So we want to be a forward-looking board that, values people being, as Ralph was saying, open with problems and working on corrections. And so we don't fail people if they're open with problems and working to correct it. So I like that aspect of compliance. And failure would be the case of we've completely dropped something and lost ground. And we, taken the eye of personalized learning because we were focusing on social emotional because of all the gun violence issues, that would be a problem for us. So I think I like the idea of compliance. I like the idea of being transparent and forward-looking. I like the idea of still being in compliance even though you have problems. And I'll say that the school improvement plans we work on cut across all the fundamentals. And the goal of the school improvement plans is to highlight the problem areas and work on them. Now there should be some sort of pivot table that brings those school improvement plans back into the fundamental review so we can see how we're doing in that context. But we don't, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I can understand we don't do that right now. I think our language reviews are interesting, but they don't allow us to optimize the system across all fundamentals. And that's kind of why we want to have a strategic discussion around this. So strategic discussion allows us maybe to de-emphasize one fundamental and maybe re-emphasize another without losing ground that we've already taken. So that's one of the things we could be discussing today or moving forward, that this is something we want to do. We want to prioritize certain fundamentals over others in terms of improvements without losing ground in other areas. The other thing I will agree with Deborah on is the fundamentals are very broad, and that's by design. A lot of things can fit in them. But we've used the superintendent's interpretation to kind of focus them onto 5 or 6 areas. And in the past, we have not changed the superintendent's interpretation to help change priorities around these type of things. So they've kind of stayed the same for 5 or 6 years. I think as we discuss this today, we could also talk about a refresh of the superintendent's interpretation that may be more warranted than a fundamental reinterpretation. For one example I'll give you is, we could be focusing on STEM versus liberal arts and how do we think about that. And that's really an output of the superintendent's interpretation and not really a change needed in fundamentals. That's one of the reasons we focused on languages as opposed to computer languages. I think those are opportunities for us to discuss as well. Again, it supersedes kind of the very quick language changes that we have in our board meetings, and is worthy of kind of a longer term strategy discussion as to where we want to go and where we want to focus. I think all our fundamentals, we might think about how do we refocus these for the needs of the 21st century versus the 20th century, and what does that refocusing mean? Is it a refocusing on the fundamental itself, or is it a refocusing in the superintendent's interpretation? And then I do think, finally on metrics, are there new metrics that need to come out that represent this change, this tilt in focus, and yet preserve some of the metrics that allow us to not lose ground that we already have gained. And that would be the final thing. And I don't think any of these discussions really feel in place during a fundamental review, because that's kind of much more operational and in the moment and reflects last year. And it doesn't feel in place for a language review either, because we can't balance off fundamentals. We only talk about one fundamental at a time, not all 6 of 6. So I think this is super important that we do have these type of discussions, and we do kind of look at this focusing. And I think we have a lot more control as a board than the fundamentals feel like they have right now. I think they're great general goodnesses, but I think we have to make hard calls on some of these as to which way we want to tilt them. Finally, last one on metrics. I think some of our metrics have gotten old. I mean, these aren't metrics where 100% is always achievable and is always the goal. And if you continually have the same tired metrics, I think you lose energy on focusing and improving them. So they're, you may, 100% may not be achievable always. And so it's an opportunity to kind of rethink or refreshen or retarget some of those to really meet what we want to meet as a board. Those are my 6 points.
Do your metrics establish a goal number that you're looking for?
No.
Well, maybe in the student school improvement plans, when they pull out a particular one, they will say we're at this percent, our goal is to get to this percent. And we do come back to that, then next year when they do school improvement plans, they'll review how they did last year, and they maybe didn't meet their goals, so they're talking that one or tweaking it in some way. So I find that really valuable to hear how they're projecting they can improve and whether or not they did meet and why that might be the case.
There's a lot of progress made in the school improvement plans. That's where all the energy suddenly seems to go in versus into maybe the fundamentals reviews themselves.
And also,
So that's highly worthwhile to
Yeah.
review that.
And
and it's great work, and it also seems like there's a lot of autonomy given to the principals and the superintendent. I mean, that's presented to us to simply approve. And it's kind of a reflection of the fundamentals and the review, but when it's presented to us, I don't get the impression that we're being asked to tweak it much.
That's right.
So there's a
yeah.
lot of autonomy given to the superintendent of the schools.
And they also seem to pay attention to what each other's doing, like with the multiple elementary schools. I feel like they often see what the other one's doing. They might have something similar, but it's really customized to their their issues.
So do you use the school improvement plan numbers to assess your ends? No, so they're.
we don't hear very much about them at all. I mean, I've heard about them once.
Well, we get it at the beginning of the year, how they did last year, what they're gonna do this year.
So I just want to, there's a couple things, I'm not going to remember all of them, I should have written them down. But, and I have a pen in my hand and paper. With regards to compliance, the only thing that I look at it differently, my lawyer head. There's compliance and then there's not in compliance. Not in compliance does not mean failure. It means not achieving the standard or the goal. So it isn't a bad thing, and when we encourage our kids to stretch, we need to encourage our educators to stretch too. So I would never think that it's a failure to try and stretch and it not be successful, because we're not addressing failure or success, because what is that, right? We still haven't decided, but I don't know that we're ever going to decide that. I think that, what was I going to say? From being outside a community member to being on the board, and I didn't do the watching that Brian did, so I don't have that experience, but to know, things aren't all roses here. I think the feeling overall right now is people are really happy. But there's still people that aren't. I mean, we hear that there's people, or small numbers moving away because they're not getting what they need, or there's kids being pulled out. Privet has a huge population, if you can afford it. Hamlin Robinson has a ton of Mercer Island kids. So just in my experience as a parent at the district, and not in terms of my kid, but just being here and hearing, when I first came in, it was the dyslexia and the kids that had reading challenges or different ways of learning. Their needs weren't being met, and there was this big, challenge there. Then, then we added the elementary foreign language, and that wasn't necessarily met with the greatest support, at least from the community, or frankly from the teachers in schools. And then now it's more of the social emotional learning. And we do provide a ton, and I think that it's fair to say, I'm talking to other districts, I think we're so far and above, ahead of other districts. But when we look at the numbers that like Youth and Family Services says, where when they do the statistics, where 70–80% of our kids feel anxious all the time, we're not we need to shift how we're addressing things. And I don't feel like, I'm not telling anyone how to do it, but to me, and it doesn't mean we're not in compliance, but we could be doing something better, or we could be doing something different that achieves those things. I don't see, and I think that this is, from what kind of everybody said, I love what you said about the fundamentals and the superintendent's interpretation. I think that could really be the way to go. I mean, I want to hear more, but I like that. Because that's going to be more, it's first of all not coming from us, not coming from, non-operations, but also, it's a changing world, and that's going to change every year or 2 or 3, or even, I mean, I think that's the place for it. But to be a community member who, to the point where they feel like they need to pull their kid out and send them to a private school because our district is not meeting their needs, and then here we are every year and every meeting finding everything in compliance, kind of a slap in the face. So I'm not saying that people aren't doing well, I'm not saying people aren't working hard and doing the best they can, but to be one of those parents who feels so extremely, they need to go spend $30,000, $40,000 a year on their child's education because the public school isn't meeting their needs, and then here we are on the board saying, you're in compliance, you're in compliance, you're in compliance. Feels funny. So I don't know how we solve that, but it feels funny to me. It feels very exclusive. Like if you're in here, then great, we welcome you. If you're out here, sorry. I think the last thing is, in terms of the metrics, we're seeing statistics, at least, from the last one, because that's what's fresh in my head. We saw a number of students in, foreign language. But what kind of experience are they having? Are they getting out of it? Can they go be an exchange student and they're able to get by? I don't expect anyone to be fluent, after high school language, frankly. But, are they able to get by? Are they getting what they need, what they want? Is it meeting their expectations? And we hear how many are doing it. So, I mean, most of them, we've got college-bound kids, they have to take 2 years of foreign language to get into college, right? For the most part, I'm not as familiar with some of you that have older kids, but when I was going, we had to take 2 years to get into college, but we didn't have a requirement in high school. So when most of our kids are going to college, of course it's going to be a high percentage, because they have to. But are they getting quality experiences from that foreign language?
So that is a case of a metric that, when we review the following board meeting, we have the opportunity to change metrics. So we have the ability, maybe in the current form, to address some of that, I think. And that's the job of individual board members to propose a metric that is maybe more reflective of your interests or the board's interests.
I think one of the things I'm wondering about, and actually we're about a point where I really want Jennifer and Fred to jump into the conversation with you two.
I'd still like to speak.
Oh, yeah, so I'm hearing what you said about you can create your metrics. I'm hearing that if your metrics are in compliance, then how would you know to create new metrics? So if you have and I'm not there, so I'm really asking this question. So if you get data that shows we're on track, then what would cause you to decide you needed a new metric?
This discussion, what Deborah's
Okay.
really proposing is a
And these are
tilt in
okay.
foreign languages from literacy, reading, writing, to fluency, conversational fluency. That's a pretty significant tilt, not what we do.
It would be a metric of, instead of participation in foreign language at 9th, 10th, 11th, it would be a metric of adequacy of instruction delivery by the students. I don't know if we're allowed to ask that question.
No, Jennifer did say AP test is a good.
AP test is one way. I
Yeah,
mean, there
good
are
metric.
tests out there of fluency, but if we're gonna do that, then what are we not gonna do?
Yeah.
And you're gonna say that is by selecting a metric like that, you are definitely saying a focus of the district is on foreign language
Mastery.
mastery.
That was just an example. You could put that in any subject.
Correct.
Yeah.
But by tilting the indicators that way, I like this word tilt, is that you're definitely giving a focus, which has not happened in the past.
So Tracy, and then I really would like Fred and Jennifer to kind of, I didn't know I was gonna ask. But I'll move to the next
And
question.
we have it
I've been doing
reversed.
some homework. I've been doing some on-the-fly homework.
I think this conversation has really led us to where we really need to hear from staff. So, but Tracy, you
So
go
Mike,
first.
you have a little time to formulate your thoughts.
Thank you.
Just a quick thing on the compliance. I feel like compliance is not saying we've given the district an A+. It's a pass. So it could be we're meeting 70 or even 65% of what we have set out to do. And as a parent who has kids who don't fit into the norm, and I even started out my older daughter in private school because the district didn't at the time have a gifted program to fit her needs. I didn't feel like it was a slap in the face if they felt like they were meeting compliance. I felt like, well, this is a unique situation. I'm in this position to be able to do this. I'm going to do it. And when I hear things about, what everybody's going to college and my other daughter's not going to college, I don't feel like that's the district being out of compliance. Just like when a kid takes 4 years of foreign language and wouldn't be considered fluent, that's not necessarily a failure of the system. Some kids are going to thrive in that foreign language environment and become fluent with just a few years of instruction, and others are going to take longer and they won't necessarily make to fluency. And that's okay to me. Compliance is not saying we're meeting all kids' needs in every single way. And that's just my interpretation. But I wanted to also talk about the breadth or the broadness of these fundamentals. I personally really I feel like it's broad so as to be inclusive of all the different ways that we educate children and all the different kinds of learners that we have. And that's why I would resist prioritizing them, because I feel like so much of it is important in order to educate the whole child. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that every kid's going to get everything that's in these fundamentals. Not everyone will take a foreign language if they're in special ed. They're going to find another way to do it. They'll do sign language, or they'll have an exception because of their learning disability, even though it's now a state requirement to use foreign language, for example. I feel like when I read through these, I like so much about it. I think actually the thing I like the least is the vision. But the themselves, I feel like I think they're great. And I like that we can each year look at them and say, oh, we might need to tweak it here. I like seeing that we've revised them 10 times or whatever that number is there. I almost feel like we could go on just year by year adapting them. But when you ask the question at the beginning, why would we need an update? The thing that rises to the top for me is looking at that poster over there. I remember getting this poster in my classroom when I was a teacher at IMS, and I must have missed the meeting where they actually explained what that poster was. And I sort of felt like, why are you just giving me this poster and putting it in my classroom? I need some sort of training. Maybe they gave it and I missed the meeting, but what does this mean to me as a teacher? And how are these fundamentals that the board is spending so much time on and the community gave input on, I can read them as a community member, but as a teacher, I felt a disconnect. And so for me, I would like, if we're going to review these, I think the best reason to review them is to get that. And I like the second question that you have is, how do we see this in the classroom? I want to hear about that. And if we're going to review these, my number one priority would be to get teacher input. How are these working for you right now? What do you see as valuable? What would you say we don't really need? What would you add to make it work for you? So that's
Right. So I think that's a great segue. This is we talked a minute ago about the will of the board in the classroom. Vision 2020 is the will of the board. These are what you're measuring. So Don, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So that is a great segue. How is it impacting in the classroom for teachers and, more importantly, our children, our students? Interesting to hear what Tracy said, because that's almost, it was like she was a fly on the wall in a conversation I had with an administrator who was a teacher in our system. I said, tell me, kind of the same question. That was the same thing, this poster appeared in my room, I must have missed the training. So that was very curious for me as to if this is the guiding work that the board is saying, this is our vision, this is our mission, this is our priority, even though it doesn't use that exact word, that should, in my mind, be what's driving the work for teachers and then ultimately our students. There is, okay, so you've all got the board policy. This is the policy, this is the work of the board, this is the language of the board, and so it's staff's job to implement and put the practices in place. So we do have an instructional practice, but again, I don't think that this is really truly reflective of best practices. Ralph, I did start a brief history. It's 2 pages. And this is only one of the files that Kendall was able to pull, and I've had some conversations, and Jennifer's tried to fill in some of the holes. And interesting, Penny Gantis was the first big hole to fill in because this started as a foundation.
Big idea.
Big idea in 2007 and 08. And the Schools Foundation actually established a steering committee with 30 people on it, that they were searching for a single vision that will be compelling to everyone in the community and enable the Mercer Island Schools Foundation to move to the next level in fundraising for our schools. And so then they eventually started a committee that was actually more foundation members than district members, and this is just numbers from a little bit of the research of the files of what was occurring. They had their first meeting in March of 08 and called themselves the Really Big Idea Committee. They had reps from different constituents and considered the question in the broadest sense, what kind of knowledge and skills will students need to be successful in the 21st century? Just an interesting tidbit, the co-chairs of the meeting were Superintendent Plano and MIEA President Margarita. So I did even try to have a bit of a conversation with Mike. He's retiring now, so it wasn't a very focused conversation. So they did some work in 08 and then began some work with the board as it transitioned more to a vision leadership committee. In October, they had a board special meeting that included staff and members of what they were now calling the 2020 Vision Leadership Committee. They had a slide deck that was presented, and their plan stated that they wanted to share the 2020 vision with stakeholders in the community, align the vision with the SIPs, and focusing professional learning communities around the vision and continuing the dialogue. There was $10,000 allocated to start it, and then the work of the board at their retreat in July of 09 was to clarify and agree to the overall district vision and district mission and values. And so they did that work that is still in place, and then they had goal number 1, which actually did put a date. It said by August 2011, the Mercer Island School District will provide more personalized learning where student-centered education is responsive to students' strengths and learning styles, passions, and affinities. And then in August of 09, so the next month after that, the board determined that they wanted to memorialize the work of their retreat, and so instituted Board Policy 2020, successfully prepared students for the cognitive, global, and digital world. They were doing some really heavy lifting as you read through the board minutes and the kind of history of this. The heavy lifting that I see they were doing was certainly this vision and mission statement and this changing of practices in the district, and really instituting their governance policy and their operational expectations at the same time. So Jennifer's nodding because I had the conversation with her and she went, yeah. It was that was really heavy lifting to try and get that kind of work
lots
done.
of discussion about what are we doing and what should we be doing in terms of, you guys stay above the line, and that's great. But they walked into a situation where they were above and below the line, and, directing classrooms to do X, as well as talking about a 2020 vision. So they had a lot of work to do in terms of turning it into a board with a.
So then the implementation piece would be the piece that perhaps hasn't been as delineated as it could have been over the years. I think that would be the work that I know that Fred and I, as we have future visioning discussions, and Jennifer pipes in with us, she's leaving us, but we're saying, okay, what are the next steps? It really probably is more along the lines of the procedures. When we look at this really isn't the guiding work of our classroom teachers, and how do we support them? But the concern is the volume of work that administration is engaged in the fundamental reports. It is a volume of work, which you all have acknowledged and stated. That volume of work, if we're going to really dive deep into the work to support classroom teachers, there is just not the bandwidth. Something is going to have to give as to how do we get that focus that I think I've heard you talk about individually to me as well as a group, but sustain this pretty complex system that has been put in place. That's the question. I'm not sure just the three of us here have really been able to come up with a plan as to how to sustain as it is, but yet build a system that is truly at the classroom level for supporting teachers. We have some great ideas of how we feel some multi-tiered systems of support need to be implemented and put in place for all of our staff, our administrators, and our teachers and in the classroom. But again, how do we do that work and sustain this? And I will maybe let Jennifer jump in with some of her thoughts.
So what I said to Donna when we were first talking about the fundamentals is they are compliance. They're not innovation. And I think that's.
They're not what?
Innovation. Or they're not, we're not implementing because of the fundamentals, I think is a good way to put it. And so that has been a challenge of mine, frustration of mine, is that I feel like what we're trying to do is tell you that we're doing okay. When in reality, I would rather be focused on X and saying, hey, and we're making gains. I will tell you that yes, it has allowed us, as you pointed out, with social emotional. We were talking about the way before, my colleagues in other districts were talking about it. But what systemic changes are we doing versus what are we doing at a building level, or in the individual classroom? Molly Harnish used to teach second grade, and there was mindfulness going on in her classroom, a version of mindfulness going on in the classroom 6, 7, 8 years ago, right? But that was Molly Harnish's classroom with those 22 second graders that she had that year. So I think that's one of the things that as I've lived the system and off and on. I will tell you that it's interesting. So I have a pretty good, what do you call it, organizational system as far as when you guys start talking about the fundamentals the second time around, right? So the second meeting, right? I keep notes, and then I truly do go back to those notes and say, so it was me who said, we've added leadership, right? So we've got to come up with some indicators. Technically the indicators are yours, not ours, so I will remind you of that. But, so we do have a way to come back and look at things. But like Deborah just said, so as Fred was saying, I was doing homework as well as he was doing homework. Deborah just said that we have kids going off to, I think it was, you had two things. One, kids were taking courses off campus. I will tell you that in 2007, we had 170 kids who took took a semester course that was counted onto their transcript that was from an outside organization. And in 2016, we had 8. So,
But how does that work with Running Start?
Running Start I'm not talking about. I'm talking about these are courses outside credit for institutes other than MIHS. And Running Start is not considered, Running Start is considered part of us.
So does the 80 include online courses? Or is
No,
that separate?
this is outside institutions, all right.
Where they
So I'm just,
physically-
I'm saying, but what I'm saying is that we have data that would, you know.
I would want Running Start to be in that,
Perfect.
but,
you
because
know,
I think that
but
meets
it's,
my
but
kids'
it's,
needs.
you know, it's like you have an interest, right? And so then we can look at ways we can answer that specific question, but by answering that question, which question don't I have to answer? So I will do that. Interestingly enough, private schools, there were 519 kids in 2007 that went off to private school that had had 98040 zip codes. It's really nice that we were one zip codes. So we can call Sacred Heart and say how many 98040s you have, and they can easily draw it up for us. In 2016, we had 405, yet our population is larger. So, you know, I mean, what does that tell us?
Is this 2007?
It's 2000, so it's 2007 versus 2016.
That's before or after the crash? It's just-
Yeah, exactly.
That's before, right?
Exactly,
Before.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
before, that was before the crash. But anyway, so it's, what I'm trying to say is that we've never been asked, we've always put the indicators out there in terms of the compliance piece, and very rarely do we get asked a very specific question that might lead us in a direction for focus. That then, in my mind, would help move the system forward, as opposed to thinking about individual classrooms and helping out. I mean, different learners, Fred was involved in the front end of that as a building principal. But when we brought in new curriculum, it's now in our fourth year, and I would say we now have systemically a new literacy curriculum. But the system takes a long time. But it was an identified problem, and we moved forward. It really doesn't appear anywhere in the fundamentals. We could put it in there, but it's not one that, because you put a lot of different things in there. But it was a, you know, kind of, it's almost separate. Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. Personally, I appreciate the vision, because I think it needs to go somewhere. I would totally agree with Tracy, and the other person's comment was, rollout was not systemic for our staff. I mean, I give kudos to our principals now, who have spent a fair amount of time talking about the different fundamentals and kind of where things fit, and making sure the SIP aligns with, you'll notice the SIPs are focused, right? They don't address all 7 fundamentals by design.
And the SIPs need to be, and this is as an educational leader for me, the SIPs are the living documents that, as a superintendent, when I'm talking with a principal, that's the document I want to discuss with them. That's the document we want to look at for how their school is moving forward. And their staff should be integral in creating that document. It's not just principal sitting and thinking these are wonderful ideas, this is what I want everyone to do. It doesn't work that way. It has to be that there's a team that's doing that document, and it's not, okay, the board approved it, we'll put it on the shelf and not look at it. It's gotta be one of those things that becomes the strategic document for the staff to be using as they're working through what are the best practices. There has to be some trust level, because yes, there's a focus, and it might be literacy. But there has to be the trust that the other things, like yes, there's a lot of really great things here, and yes, we want to be educating the whole child and talking about inclusion and highest standards for all curricular areas. But right now, as a site or as an elementary, we are going to be really focused on this, and this is the depth we're going to go in. But there needs to be some trust that we are maintaining those other pieces that are part of the vision.
So what I'm hearing is, and Fred, it's your chance to go next, but just introductions. What I'm hearing is fundamentals, really good, broad, whole child. a lot of work for administration and superintendent, and perhaps doesn't give credit to innovations in teaching and supporting his teachers for innovative change to eventually accomplish those type of things. So maybe the answer is an eighth fundamental, which is teaching with fundamentals, is just pile on. Or maybe it's to take out a little bit of that each fundamental and wedge in a portion of teaching scaffolds or teaching innovations to go on. I don't know. I'm just
There are a
throwing-
few things in the fundamental that do raise a couple of red flags for me as to, because some of them were from 08, 09, and there's some things that as evidence and research shows us that that's sort of debunked or isn't the best practice anymore, so those things I would want the board to be aware of.
Those are, you're talking about the 2020 procedure.
No, also, some of the wording in the fundamentals as well.
Oh, okay, great, okay,
Yeah.
good deal. I don't think the fundamentals preclude us doing professional development around a particular,
Can you say that one more time?
I don't think the fundamentals preclude us from doing professional development around any given topic, right? I think, I'll go back to the idea is that you can't focus on everything, right? And so if we truly want good social emotional learning going on K-12, that requires a significant staff development plan and implementation. And that means that you're not gonna, we are going to maintain our academic standards. I'm not sure that you're ever gonna see 100% on any of the academic standards.
Fine, but.
No, I was just agreeing. I don't think that would be the expectation at all.
I'm curious to know what Fred's gonna say, because we didn't talk about this at all.
Fred and I have talked, though.
So my arrival in the district was 09-10 down at Lake Ridge, so it was right when the 2020 vision was being rolled out. It had been conceptualized, and so it was interesting because part of my interview process started nudging towards it, but it was pretty undefined at that point. But I remember putting together my first PowerPoints and presentations to stakeholders, mostly geared towards staff, but the parents as well, and I was creating a pyramid of, okay, students are at the top, and then I was going through what are the goals within the classroom, what are the teacher goals, what are my goals, what are the school goals, all the way down to the 2020 vision, and that was brand new for the teachers. I had thought they were more invested at that point, so that was an aha for me right away, was, okay, they don't know a lot about this yet, so really this is in its infancy. So I was doing a lot of work. When I think of that poster then, the first fundamental of the board at that time, I think they acknowledged that there were a lot. The first iteration was it 9 fundamentals was the
Yes.
first
There were
iteration,
9,
I believe.
yes.
So I think the idea was, wow, that's a lot for everyone to focus on. So personalized learning, which was number 3 at the time, not number 1 as it is now, that became our focus. The poster then was because that was about the instructional practice that was supposed to start moving the needle towards personalized learning, which was shifting using Fisher and Fry's model to go from stand and deliver, sage on the stage, direct instruction to how do you gradually release the responsibility of learning over to students. Within about a year, and this was, I was still in the principal seat and not attending board meetings regularly and still a bit distant from this process. There was a decision that was made to abandon the focus on 1 or 2 fundamentals, and it was, we're gonna just monitor them all. I don't know the exact logistics behind that. Jennifer, you might have been in the
Yeah,
rooms
so
at that
when
point.
the personalized learning became the focus, it actually was taken out of the fundamental list and put up top. So there's some version of the 2020 procedure or policy that has it up top. Then they said, but wait a sec, we care about these other things too.
Right.
So there was considerable board conversation. And then they said, well, let's make personalized learning fundamental 1, even though we're not in a hierarchy. And then we're gonna have 5 more. So we had 6 at that point in time, yeah.
So my point is not to point criticism at the past, it's rather let's not repeat the same mistakes, which is that model off of Fisher and Fry, who are very distinguished professionals in our profession and have a tremendous amount of research, we never fully developed that. We never came out with professional development. So for teachers who say it landed in my classroom, there wasn't anything behind it, and largely because there wasn't time to put anything behind it, because personalized learning then just became part of everything else you need to do. So let's get, you know, we were running an iPad initiative at that time and all these other things, which are all great, but it was, okay, we didn't let it seep in. So let's not repeat that. So I appreciate this conversation because you as a board are leading out in front and taking time to look behind to make sure that there are followers back there. And the degree to which there are followers, I think it is, will be important in our next iteration, because right now, it is a rare day when I hear someone say, our vision is. It's always the board's vision, Gary's vision, Donna's vision, the district's vision, but I don't hear them say it's our vision. And I think that's part of what I hear you saying is, let's involve the staff and our administrators probably have important things to say, our teachers, our parents and others, so that everyone feels invested in it and it doesn't become your vision, because if it's just yours, it's not gonna have the teeth. When I look at some of the metrics, like Brian, you were saying, you know, we see some of the indicators come through and it's like, we need to flag those and say, well, what are we gonna do to move that needle? We have 51 parent marks within the EES, 42 students and 66 staff members to choose from. Those don't all show up in the fundamental reports because we've cherry-picked the ones that apply to those. But my input back and my suggestion back is, let's do go, I mean, I would hope we do go in a direction of, let's narrow in on what do we want to prioritize right now, because then we can look at those metrics and say, what does that mean qualitatively, what does that mean quantitatively, and then what are we going to do to make some difference and some aggregate in that, so we can start to build towards that. And finally, I would just say, even the fundamentals themselves, when I look at the values, and then I go through the fundamentals, if I look at leadership, that's 5. Innovation, creativity is 5. Personal development is 3. Then it goes 2, 6, 7, 5, 4, 4, 1. The values, the fundamentals then to me are the sieve with which we look through, and everything else funnels through, because it has to align, because they're really super value statements. If you take away the resume language of putting a verb on the front one, and you just say personalized learning, highest standards, self-awareness, empathy, and you take away the verbs, then you can put the verbs back in when you're ready to set the goal. Because the verb then becomes the goal for what these are, which are really super values of what we all believe in, none of which should be taken out in my own opinion, but it's hard to, when they're all important, it's hard to know which one is important and which one to work on, knowing that we don't have unlimited resources.
You talk a little bit about, so you talked about there really wasn't the ability to have any focus, the PD, around what these look like in the classroom. So what's been the impact of that? So you're measuring metrics here, so talk about where you see the fundamentals in classrooms right now in virtual learning.
I think our conversation as a cabinet has been pockets, but not systemic. And so Jennifer used the example of mindfulness, and that's been going on with a particular teacher for many years. If you want to focus on just personalized learning, as that was the original statement of that's where we're going to focus, you know, then there's, well, what's the description of that? The newest educational evidence and research coming out now is saying there's no teachers. No one can agree on what personalized learning actually, how you define it.
That's really problematic because it was thrown out there many, many years ago. And now it's, well, how do we define that? What does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that mean for our children, right? So
Well, how do you measure it?
and how do you measure it, exactly. But I think when we talk about engagement of students, that has a little more meaning. We know that engagement of students occurs through social emotional learning because they feel like they have a relationship with that teacher that's in front of them. But then we also have to talk about engagement of students in real deep learning versus just surface, right? So when we talk about the kinds of teaching practices that are just at a rigor level of minimal versus really deep learning with solid questioning strategies with certainly, I think one classroom Fred and I looked in and walked out and we went, you know, there were some great classroom management strategies in there, but the rigor and the depth of learning that was occurring really could have gone to a much deeper level for kids versus some great classroom management. So yes, the kids were engaged because the teacher knew she had to get them up and get them moving and even have them walking, but there wasn't enough communication for the kids. There wasn't any collaboration going on for the kids, and what does that look like in deep learning and rigor? That's professional development. I think for me, pretty quickly in, it became about the breadth of our professional development. And this happens in so many places. I've seen this happen in other districts as well, and it's probably a bad analogy, but it's a shotgun approach. Let's try, we've got so much, let's put everything out there and kind of see what sticks for people. Yes, we want our teachers to have autonomy and choice because we know that's better for them in professional development, but we have to have some focuses within that choice. But there also has to be some systemness to it. And clearly heard that from our principals of, you know, we need some pieces from the district office that give us that system piece that does go systemic across the district as well.
Just there, in your last Fundamental 5 report, there's the percentage of students. It says, my teacher helps us learn in more ways than just talking in front of the class.
Yeah.
So that poster should address this fundamental, or should address that EES question. And our elementary kids have gone 88, 83, 85, 80, 89. And middle and high school have gone 64, 67, 66, 63, 68. Had we really focused on that, my prediction is we would have been able to talk about how do you go from that upper left to the lower right on that, and where are we trying to go. We've done other things that have been tremendous and that have been fantastic, and our kids are continuing to excel. But I would love to be able to say, yeah, we're going to focus on this, and we can move that needle. We can give the teachers the professional development and experience that's going to retain them, as according to the statistics and the data, as much as any compensation we're going to give them within reason. You know, those other things are why do they want to stay, and what do they want to do to be here. So I'm just adding on to what you're saying.
And I think just historically as well, and this is just my knowledge being in an education system during the crash. So you kind of read through the different board meetings and how the vision and the heavy lifting were occurring for the fundamentals and the operational expectations. Where I was, 9-10 was a horrific year in public education. In my conversations, it's been pretty similar here, maybe a little bit later. And so imagine that as well. We've got this vision, we've got these things that we want to move forward with, but now the dollars are gone. So then there was
And the people.
and the people. So then there was a shift. And
you know, we're still trying to do some of that restore back. When I came in August and having the conversation of, you know, spending down fund balance, we were able to do that, but there were still some reductions. When we kept the reductions far from the children as possible, but impacted teachers, right? Because it was instructional coaches, and there wasn't a ton of instructional coaches. I've seen when dollars have been restored to districts where it's an instructional coach per school, you know, based on numbers of students or numbers of teachers, and so that still is something that absolutely supports professional development. But then the support for the instructional coaches, so they know the best practices that they need to be working through. So of course, budget plays into the history of any of these pieces as well as to what are you able to emphasize.
So that question was fascinating, how it relates to that. That's probably one of 35 things that we were monitoring for that one. So that might also speak to, if we want to add focus to this, eliminating some either redundant questions or questions that maybe aren't reflective of our current focus.
Well, and you made it, I think it was you that made it, we were talking about cohorts too. I mean, look at fundamental two, we don't look at cohorts. And that's really what we should be looking at, I totally agree with you.
So I just, off-topic question, those, what are DES surveys?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about, it takes a lot of work for you to prepare them, it takes a lot of work to look at them. Students take a lot of time to fill in the bubbles for them too. Does the district, I think you also looked at more granular analysis of that, or are you only doing that EES stuff for the board's benefit?
I would say that it's used in other places, it's definitely used in other places, and it is at the building level too. We don't report that, but each of the buildings, we get back
Sure.
and utilize it.
Okay, that was most valuable.
Yeah, and that's the most valuable piece.
And I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
All of the data points, or just that one you were just talking about?
No, that's the entire report.
Yeah, they'll go through their entire report, and we usually spend the summer having one-on-ones with them, talking about, you know, what's going on in there, what are they seeing. Principals naturally go right to the leadership one, because that one's gonna be most about them. And so they always wanna spend a lot of time on that at first, and then, you know, they use that to start setting their goals for themselves. But then they start looking at the school in a different way. And so you'll see a lot of times in their SIPs, they'll have references to EES, and that's the stuff they've extracted because they know they need to work on that. We've also done some degree of looking at the district level questions, the ones that, and this is pretty typical too, the ones that are poorest amongst all of them altogether are how much support they get out of this building, right? And we talked to Greg about that, and he said, well, every district, the district gets hammered the hardest. But we have to look at that too and say, well, what aren't we doing? And what could we do?
How much time in terms of percentage of your time are you spending on, you know, purely gathering this data, analyzing it so that you can report it? And not, I'm sure it drives a lot of your work, but less than that. What?
Depends on the fundamental. I will tell you fundamental 2 takes Christy Gregory 25, 30 hours. So basically a week of work, like solid week of work. And that's because she's done it 5 times. A little worried because the next university coming in will probably take them twice as long.
Who's this position? What's it?
It's our
Christy
data
is our,
analyst.
yeah, she's our
Student data.
information system coordinator. She runs Skyward and does all kinds of data stuff. Some of the other ones,
But does she enter, she enters the data?
no.
No.
So she's pulling the data from
Okay.
numerous sources, but it never comes up clean, right?
Right.
I mean, we can get the ASPEC results from the state, and this is what the state has presented, that kind of thing, but when you ask how many students, what's the percentage of students that took the AP Spanish exam, and what percentage passed, that's a data point she has to manipulate, right?
But But then you guys are the ones that analyze them.
Well, then we take a look at it, yeah, with her help too, but, you know, because she flags things that she works through the reports. But yeah, then we take a look at it and see if there's something we can glean from it that's standing out to us or a trend that doesn't seem right.
Do you think that that would be happening if you weren't having to do the reporting?
I think there's pieces of it that we always look at, right? I don't think we would look at all of the indicators that are there.
So it's really an issue of the number of indicators.
Yeah, it's hard to go, I think the same amount of time would go into looking at the data, but it would be focused into a few that we'd be really pulling out versus all of these that we're pulling out. So it's that quantity quality question. You know, when we noticed the problem on students being identified for ICAP and the number of boys being, you know, 2 and 3 to 1 compared to girls, we spent a lot of time on that, and then we started addressing that, and over time that's flatlined out. I think that kind of work will continue as well. It's just hard to do that when you're doing all the numbers.
Right. So a good example, so that's fundamental two, so but we can stay with fundamental two for a minute. We have this AP addendum, which talks all about, it was in response to a board concern, or community concern, that we were not having kids take the AP exam. And the practice has changed at the high school, and it's much more about, kid, we want you to try this, take a risk. You may not pass, how can we help support you, those kinds of things. And so it changed, the culture has changed. I'm not sure that the monitoring is needed anymore, right? And so that's, you know, so that, I mean, literally, it's maybe an addendum with 25 data points on it, which may or may not, but I think we've not had those conversations. You have not had those conversations as a board to talk about where are we then now focused. What's our question? So your question is about, you know, off-campus enrollment, right? Is that an area to be focused on? Maybe, right? But let's, you know, if you're going to focus on that, you can't focus on everything. So, you know, that we move forward. Yeah.
I think this might be a good time, a little more than halfway through to do a bio break. Great. Pardon?
A bio break.
Yeah, I was just hoping we could do that.
Can I say one more thing? The rest of the fundamentals don't take near the time for the data, but the development of the vignettes is a considerable burden on the principals. Right? Yeah.
And I would say ours, because, and, you know, obviously you've gone back and looked at the previous ones, and you see that some of them are, you know, they're just continuations or some tweaks or whatnot. So those are a little bit easier now than when they first were being written. But you know, we usually start about 2 months ahead of time. We know when it's coming, and we start putting it on the principal's radar and our radar. We start going. So we flag it about 2 months in our ILT meetings, and then we have working documents in Google forms that everyone starts editing and everyone's working on at the same time, and then we compile it all back together and compress it. We ask for a week's time. Sometimes our principals are better than others. We forget that we completely get it. So.
And I'm hoping, you know, those principals also have a staff of 40 to 60 people to write one of those vignettes, you know. I'm assuming. I mean,
They do get some
They
support
write.
from the staff. Yeah.
well,
Teachers.
They get input because they get, you know, what's out there right now, and I think the high school's done a really nice job where they put it out in front of everyone and then have them think, okay, what have I done in the past year? And then they submit things, they have these like exit tickets and staff meetings, and then the principals who work with that particular student follow up, get information, and then they write it. Because the other challenge is trying to make it a little bit cohesive for you, so you're not getting all these different
16
tenses.
authors.
And I know it's not great, I'm sure Tracy preaches when she says some of it. We do our best to try to get voice to be common, but it's a little
You
bit
got the
funky.
former engineer, you know, editing, so.
And there are times at the beginning when I jumped in and said, well, why aren't we including this here? And Fred said to me, no, we're saving that one. We need that one for this other fundamental down here. So that whole idea of you can fit anything into them, sometimes we do.
All right, let's take a
Okay,
break.
buddy.
Okay.
5, 7 minutes? 10? 5?
probably do 10.
Okay.
Then,
You need 10?
I think we're have multiple people around.
Well, that'll close at 2 o'clock according to that. That's correct.
Jennifer, is it possible that there is bullet forms as well?
I think you turned it on because it was great.
Oh,
This is off.
let's go with
Roll
bubble.
the dice, depending on what you want to do
What do they
there.
do?
Do we keep this one?
So not that I'm so appropriate, but you know, I have my moments.
I'll do my piece.
Say in private, but I wouldn't say.
Standby?
Now it's recording? And did you touch that at all?
No.
Okay.
We are audio recording here.
Nope, I'm fine.
So we're good.
2 o'clock. Okay, back in session.
So I had allotted until about 2:15 for the staff board kind of interaction, and feels like I'm appreciating, just want to note that there's a lot of dialogue going back and forth, and the big idea that we really wanted to get to with this conversation, which I think I'm seeing, is really how has Vision 2020 impacted the classroom? How do we see it in the classroom? And what are the needs of the district that either impact Vision 2020 or are impacted by Vision 2020? So, take about another 15 minutes or so and kind of continue. And I would really like to encourage peppering staff with questions, because I'm sure a lot of they're kind of just emerging in your brains. And then what we'll move to after that is really thinking about, all right, what's our takeaway here, and what's our next step, if any? What should we be thinking about, where do we want to go next? So,
How were things, what was happening with the board and the district prior to 2020? Like, how did the board work?
Well, that would be a bit tricky, I think.
Were you not?
I was not attending board meetings.
Got it,
Very
okay.
good superintendent.
And so I do know, like I said, that the policy governance process
04.
was brought in 04, but was continuing to evolve through the transition from the superintendent prior to Dr. Plato, and then when he came in, there was still work that was being aligned. A lot of it by the board directors. They were working directly with consultants for the process that they were putting in place. The ODs, and there's language change as you read the minutes. Oh, what are they talking about now? Because they changed. So-
Limitations too.
Yes.
And I would imagine, I mean, we talked about this briefly before I think we started, that there was a number of superintendents before that time period.
Yes.
And so, I think the activity of the board, there's a lot of change, and perhaps, either because of the governance or because of this vision, we've had a little bit of the benefit of longevity, and maybe it's instability, and maybe because expectations were known, perhaps.
I will tell you, there's a lot turnover on the board. There's a lot of angst, and a lot of camps. You were around from that as just a resident, I think. I think you were in the building chat. We had a board president resign because she was getting hammered by the community. As my fellow board members, I mean, I didn't attend board meetings very often. I was at the director or a person, and there was visible tension.
Yeah.
Visible tension and a lot of infighting was going on.
a lot of what
Infighting, kind of fractions developed and
within the board.
within the board and then within the community as they align themselves with the board members.
There's a lot of, coming from Colorado, where we have board governance policy as well, in the district that I was in, to come to here felt kind of natural. I mean, things are done differently, but as far as boards go, since I've been here in 9 years, I mean, folks working together fairly well, and that's been really healthy. Especially as a leader within, to know that there is that stability, and, you know, that's been nice. I think that for the community, part of the success of the district in going back to fundraising and all those other pieces, passing that as a box. You know, I think there's a high degree of trust with all of you who've done a really good job of being strategic, you know, leaders in the community. So that's a real positive thing.
Yeah, and that stability, I think Gary Brown,
Yep.
really, really helped.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I think the particularly the policy piece, because I've been known to say, particularly in my administrative career, particularly as also central office, is, well, what does our policy say? Because that's the guidance that staff needs. The unique piece for me on Mercer Island has been the OEs. I've always had boards that have policy in place and goals and priorities that are worked towards, and you know, vision that is over encompassing. The OEs are still something that I'm learning and adapting. Of course, they can be adjusted and adapted as the board feels the need for that as well. So the way the system is set up, and when Harriet and I have had these conversations, it is unique. I think Tracy referred to it as the hybrid system. If you dive into it, there's pieces to it that have made it somewhat complex as to what level of the monitoring, you know, things are at, and complicated in some ways as well. But it has helped keep the stability of the board focused. I think the question that Harriet has asked, which is kind of in my burning question as well, is how is that work being transferred and implemented at the classroom level?
For new teachers and veteran teachers, because that will be a challenge. We're going to have those new teachers coming in. We get some training going down the road, but it's got to sustain itself. We can't just move on to the next piece. And, you know, when I look at what we did with the elementary literacy and the way we're able to really roll that out over multiple years and embed that, it continues today, because now we have teachers who, like tomorrow, we'll have a group of teachers in here at this time tomorrow working on, okay, so now what does that mean to our progress reports? We adjusted them once, now we need to adjust them again, because what we're really trying to tell parents and students about their learning is a little different. How is writing coming in? So we've got a flywheel going on that now. But our new teachers coming in, when we dropped off those 2 coaches last year, the new teachers coming in, where's been their professional development? So we worry a little bit about those wheels getting wobbly, not for our veteran teachers who have made a big shift. If I go back to this, they've really made a big shift. But newer teachers who may be resorting to practices that were done to them, which we don't necessarily want. We want to be able to have systemic pieces involved in that. That's a challenge.
But we do need professional development for all teachers, because for teachers, if we're saying that teacher quality, and that's what the research shows us, is it's the classroom teacher that really impacts and makes the difference for students. And if we're saying that teacher quality is one of, if not the most important thing, one of the most important things for us as a system and a district, certainly yes, new teachers are really important, but as our experienced teachers, they need to feel that ongoing support and coaching. Everyone can use a coach, and your experienced teachers always aren't your experts, just like your expert teachers always aren't your most experienced. So how do we provide that support for teachers in the classroom who are doing the most important work for our students?
So building on that, I was just reading a book and going over a lot of the theories on education.
comparing, contrasting effectiveness and stuff like that. And I think this one assumption was a lot of it goes out the door because of two things: teacher quality of instruction, and the second one was students' memory capacities, individual student memory capacity. And it kind of just went beyond all the other instructional modalities that they went through. What I'm hearing is maybe you'd like to see more emphasis on somehow getting these fundamentals down into the classroom teacher level. I'm hearing a little bit of concern about the amount of work on the fundamental reporting. And if there's another concern I'm missing right now, let me know. I'm wondering if reducing the number of metrics and focusing on certain metrics to show the focus for either the superintendent or the board would be a reasonable way to do it, as well as the tool of the superintendent's interpretation that might allow you to massage the understanding of that fundamental into both where you'd like to take it, as well as the innovation and the investment in the teachers and the messaging. Do you feel that helps get where you want to go, or it's not enough? Or is that a loaded question? You want time to think about that?
Both. I do think that, I think Harriet's point of how many, if you're looking at the fundamentals just for how many things are in there that we're attempting to measure, how many metrics are in there, it is an awful lot. The idea of taking out the verb, as Fred was saying, and just leaving what's the kernel of that, personalized learning. There are some pieces in the fundamentals, just slight word changes that I think could help clarify them a little more. I think for those of you who've worked with me now for a few months, I tend to be a little more succinct and tend to summarize things in a briefer way to get the idea across with more clarity. So that is something that I could see helping with the fundamentals. The one that glares at me a lot is in one when it talks about learning styles, because there's some research now for learning styles that says that's debunked. And so it again depends on whoever wrote this, what their definition of learning styles would be, but for me it's like that really isn't a great piece to have in there. And what is personalized learning? How do you define that? And then when you go on to a personalized learning environment, what does that look like? So definitely some focus. I think that's what we need. I think I've heard that from our principals as well, as Fred and I have talked with them, as I talk with them individually, particularly ones who have some longevity in the district that have provided some real stability for their schools, have really reiterated the desire to kind of know where their focus is. So for their SIPs, they're writing their SIPs right now for next year. And my direction was social emotional learning, really try to pull that out and look at that. The board has expressed an interest and a concern for that. Pull that in to your focus in your SIPs, because that's pushing us in a direction. But don't feel like you have to continue to do everything in there, because you need to have, they're 1 year, right? You need to have that 1 year focus. I like to think in 1, 3, and 5 year kind of chunks. And so trying to do everything every year does become burdensome.
And not deep. I mean, it's like writing your thesis. I mean, when you're getting up to getting ready to graduate, you're not not going to your other classes. You're just focusing. I like focus a lot.
Yeah, because it's not
priority.
It's not the amount of work that we have to do, because we're tired of, I mean, we love this work, and we get to come to work each day here and work in this community. But it's, are we working on the right work, all the time, or is there a sequence to which we should do 1, 3, and 5 years, setting ourselves and being able to be more strategic with Title II dollars or foundation, professional development dollars. So.
I think too, the trust that the board has to have for the system that we are doing the other work, just because we're talking about the focus, and I think part of that's why we ended up with fundamental reports for every single fundamental every year. I don't know that it was a lack of trust per se, but just this idea that it was hard to wrap our head around the fact that just because we say we're focused on social emotional, it doesn't mean we're not attending to academic needs of students. And so now we got to show you that we are, and then, oh, wait a sec, we are developing risk takers.
And equity and inclusion is embedded in all of that. I think that's part of the tricky piece in education, is so much of our work is cross-pollinated, right? It all works together as different pieces of the puzzle, and it can't work if you don't have many of the good things that are called out in the fundamentals, but they have to be working together, linked together, not in separate silos, and that's, I think, some of the work that we can engage in, certainly as staff, but also with the board, as to when we're talking about inclusion in Fundamental 7, how is that impacting and working and embedded with high academic standards, right? Because those do absolutely cross each other, and also, and how is that personalized with high, they do all work together, which is one of the lovely things about them. But if you're trying to do it all, it does become a lot.
Report on it all.
Right, exactly. I feel like Fred gave the perfect example, or a perfect example, at least in my experience here, is the personalized learning and the challenges for the literacy. And to be able to go and make sure that the curriculum meets the needs of our students. Right, and honestly, I have since that, and I know it took a while, because things take a while, but I haven't heard a word about people concerned about the literacy program since that's been fully initiated. So, obviously there might be other areas of learning, but and the same thing with the math, and the kids were losing math facts, and as it was changed, we knew that there was a pocket there that kids were going to struggle a bit, but then it would take time. But I think those things rise, they float to the top, and in order to address the big concerns, and always being aware, big when I mean broad, that being able to kind of follow the needs of the community, those are the changes that I think have had, at least that I've seen, tremendous impact in the classroom. There were kids, 3rd, 4th grade not reading. There's always going to be, but it was a big problem, and it's certainly improved. I would love to see the numbers of, I don't know how we measure that, but I'm sure there's ways, I'm sure you guys do, but with our test scores or what.
I'm sure that data exists.
Yes, I'm sure it does.
Just an anecdotal piece, David's observation today at Northwood when we walked through primary grades classrooms, and we were talking about facility and the wonderful whiteboards and the magnets, and David observed that literacy was everywhere. The classroom was such a literate place, there was word walls, and I kind of went, wow, that's a great observation from his lens, because for me, that's my expectation when I walk into a primary grades classroom. So it was great to see that his reflection, as having been on the board and as a parent looking in going, that was wonderful to see. I was like, well, absolutely, but for me, that's the way it's supposed to be as an educator. So that's an anecdotal piece that our classrooms really show that it's a literate environment, including the walls.
So just,
Let me add, one thing that these metrics do that I think serve us well, even though there's a lot of metrics, is they eliminate the anecdotal accusation from various parents. And just don't, I'm gonna use your example. I don't know if there were truly third or fourth graders that weren't reading and what the extent was. But we do have metrics that follow that. And so I think these metrics and these fundamentals save us a lot of times when various parent groups come in. Because I think parents do not have either A, the scope to see everything going on, or B, necessarily the fundamental understanding of education. And I think these metrics, I would imagine, when people bring things up, you can then point to it. And do you do that occasionally?
I think it's really important to address, I think what I'm hearing from you, and this one, for me, has always been something that every school board has to pay attention to, which is number one priority, student achievement. Why else are we here, right, if that's not what we're impacting? So when you look, I mean, certainly all of these impact student achievement, but when you look, number fundamental 2, talking about high academic standards. Well, yes, that's a given because that's going to impact student achievement. Personalized, I think one also was really, that was the intent originally, to really be about impacting student achievement. So there are some that do meet that annual report and lots of good metrics for them. I think states are even coming into that now with things like dashboards. The WISF new framework that we have is trying to look at more, and certainly yes, it's only using one level of student achievement, and we want to look at more. We know that multiple measures are going to give us so much more information, but I think student achievement has to be a paramount consideration in everything we discuss.
Well, I like
Brian
that
has
was
been trying to get his voice, so just Brian and then Tracy, and then we need to move to some, okay, where you want to go next. Okay, Brian.
I'll be brief, and I think you just touched on, I think what you just touched on what I was trying to say is, so yes, as we're looking at the fundamentals of bringing them in more concise so it's clear, and Principal Puckett at the high school recently did a video with the students, and it was kind of a fun exercise, but through that several times she said it to the point I now know there are 3 values at the high school: innovation, inspiration, and integrity. And because she repeated it again and again and again. And everyone in this district, from students to teachers to board to parents and grandparents, should be able to say, these are our values. This is our mission as a district, and be able to do it right, like the Boy Scouts do, like everyone, you know, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, thrifty. So I think redefining that there. Well, I'm an actor, so I memorize things.
I was just going to say, you got these memorized, don't you?
I don't, but I'm working on it. But the other thing too is that voice, is that parent voice. So I think that just got hit here, is that the parents are understanding not only what that vision is, but where that dashboard is. What are those numbers? I heard someone recently say, well, but there's no data to support that. And say, actually, there is the data, and let me take you right to it. And here it is, and let me show you how to read that out. And if you want more data, talk to Fred, talk to Jennifer. And in the financials, but so we have that community understanding of how this is all working, and then making sure that all that information is focused down to each individual student, so that it's working to create that differentiated learning and all those things that are important for their success. So yeah, I think that's streamlining it in there so it's more concise, it's clear, everybody can say what it is and what it means and how it impacts every classroom. I think it's really important and missing. But I think we're talking about.
Oh, I was just gonna comment that the verb on number 2 would be maintain the highest standards, because we are known as a very high achieving district, and that we can't not put that in there, but to use that particular verb, I think was a great choice of words. That was all I was gonna mention.
I will tell you it was long conversations before too.
And it seems very purposeful.
And I don't think there's a staff member here at the table, the three of us, who don't believe that data is absolutely essential for our work, and in a myriad of forms, right? Lots of different kinds of metrics. Some are much better than others. Some are that formative assessment that happens ongoing daily with teachers, that guides their instruction and allows us to have the conversations with groups of teachers or individual teachers. And some of it certainly is easier to segregate out because it is from specific benchmarks that we determine. But ultimately we want formative and summative that are helping teachers guide their practice with students. So we're not double doing things, like we're not collecting a specific data point for one single person's interest that isn't then helping to guide our work with students as well.
Can I just quickly jump in, just to address, just to, I don't disagree with what you're saying at all, and it's true. I mean, I can speak to that with specific instances, but that's not what's important. The fact of the matter is, you know, if our vision number 1 is personalized learning, and then our number 7 is equity, you know, it matters for the kids that aren't achieving. And so, and I'm not saying that you're not, but, you know, when we're saying, we have to, we just, you know, say that 88% are meeting standards, you know, people, number 1, could care about their kid. If they're not meeting standards, or they're not achieving their highest ability, then we're not meeting their needs and we're failing them. And so, you know, I mean, I think things float to the top. I think you have to pay attention to that, but obviously not exclusively. And, you know, if my kid had an issue, and Kish doesn't have any, if my kid had an issue, I would want it addressed and not be told that, you know, well, this is meeting the needs of 85% of our kids. I'm like, but mine matters. I know you don't say that, but mine matters just as much, and that's why there was the, you know, curriculum exploration for their literacy. And I mean, I don't want to say that one was easy. That one was easy because there was such unhappiness, and it wasn't meeting the needs of our kids. So I just, I think those things become, and with the social emotional learning now, just like that's floating to the top. I think things will naturally do that.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer and Fred, for good one. You too. All right, so Brian, we turn to the conversation of what are you taking away from this? What have you heard? What are your thoughts? Where do you want to go with this?
A lot of what I wrote down are things that you just said about refreshing superintendent's interpretation, perhaps that means reducing number of indicators or metrics, but less stress on staff, but also to be more focused. I don't know if I was the only one to mention maybe refreshing the vision, getting teacher input, and Donna talking about making fundamentals more succinct, professional language to reflect more up-to-date research. Though I have some disagreement about that writing styles thing. I think it's really valid personally, but that's my own personal research. So those are things I was hearing or saying.
So you just wrote those down, and I have trouble hearing your voice. So Donna, would you?
Do we want to write some up here?
Oh, that'd be good. I will do that, but somebody's going to have to say it.
And I can also just show you my notes, or I can write for you.
So the first one I heard was refresh.
The superintendent's interpretation. And I don't know that I got everything, so I'm sure we'll have more to add.
number of metrics.
I'd say we'd focus the metrics on proving the fundamental is being maintained. I think we individually added new metrics to diagnose problems over time, or to
Focus areas.
produce focus areas. And maybe some of those focus areas have kind of lost their rationale, over the ensuing years. But I think it's important as a board that, we show that social emotional learning is being maintained, the programs have continuity to them, and maybe some of the deeper diagnostics around it, what we don't want. I think we went into a lot of detail, perhaps into AP classes. Maybe we don't need to do that, but we just need to show there are AP classes, they are still being taken, there are honors classes, they are still being taken. Maybe with the equity lens, we look at that over there, but the level of detailed reporting around AP courses isn't needed. But I think there is still a desire for the board to be an oversight group who ensures that all the fundamentals continue to be maintained. And we have proof that we can then show to the community that it's maintained and remove the diagnostics. I think that's a little different tilt around it than perhaps what we were talking about, which might be a blind reduction or something like that.
Yeah, initially we got started by saying, hey, we're gonna add some metrics, we should subtract some metrics. So there's kind of a net zero, maybe there's a net subtraction, but the idea is not to go down to
And maybe
small
it's
numbers.
strategically reduced, like you're saying, we don't want to be able just to cut half of them and really, and I would want district employee input on what,
See,
as
and I
well
think,
as board input.
I think it should be driven by district, by our administration and by our teachers. And then come to us, because we approve and, if we're not fundamentally changing the vision and say we go through and maybe tweak it a little bit, but, the idea of the vision, the fundamentals isn't going to change drastically is what I'm hearing. Then as we see superintendent interpretations, in order to get, first of all, our classroom teachers, they have the pulse of what's going on directly with their kids. And also in terms of the buy-in. I mean, it's respect. It's going to the people who are doing it to say what's working and what's not working and the other information that they want to know. So, I mean, I want not to pass the buck, but I shouldn't be doing this.
Well, I think it's up to the board as well to, so I think there's two separate pieces. One is, are we maintaining the level of programs that the board is happy with? How do we think about that increasing over time, perhaps? But there's one, maintenance of the existing programs. I think as Jennifer spoke to, how do we deal with innovation? How do we deal with school improvement plans? I think that's a much broader discretion of the teachers and the staff, and and those might be the most important metrics that we expect to move in a meaningful way, and that might be tilted towards a new focus, something new we want to do, something innovative we want to do, but we also know we don't want to lose ground on kind of basic good to haves. And the basic good to haves, I think that's a discussion with the board and with the staff. I wouldn't want to confuse innovation is all we want and not have the basic good to haves, right? It's very easy to throw out and take things for granted.
And I'd also say, if there's metrics to be tossed out, who better to suggest tossing out the metrics than the administration,
Yeah.
teachers? But I see that as a suggestion or ultimately it's for the board to approve, because these are board-approved metrics.
Right.
And then the other thing though too is some of these metrics, they're gonna be collected regardless. And so, that's good for the board to know that even though we might not be asking for it to be reported, there is a possibility, depending on the metric, we could say, hey, 2 or 3 years later, we could go, I'd be interested in that metric, getting that reported back. If it was a ESS, you could just pull that up. If it was something else, then that'd be a whole different story.
Well, and certainly I'd want some things to be monitored, that we've seen them just being maintained at a good level, but what if they drop off and we're not watching that anymore? Somebody needs to be watching those and let us know when that happens.
And I would say, maintain is a positive thing, but I would always like to see reasonable growth. And that's always been our standard for compliance, was reasonable growth towards the end goal. And in those areas where we are really succeeding and very successful, we still want to see reasonable growth. We should always be working towards closing that gap.
So does that mean you want growth goals?
Yeah,
None of these are growth.
let's push back a little bit on that, because I think the growth will be when you do your school improvement plans, not on an area where you don't expect improvement, right? So say, we have personalized learning, and we say we're not going to work on personalized learning, but we are going to work on social emotional. I'd expect steady state on personalized learning, and I'd expect school improvement plans to show some change in social emotional, and if it's positive, accolades. If it's negative, we're understanding why and what we're going to do differently. And I think the problem we've gotten into is trying to expect improvements across the board, as we've talked about. It's too broad a focus, it's not concentrated, we don't know how to spend our professional development dollars appropriately, all that type of thing. But I think in some of them, we don't want to fall behind either. That's the reason for the maintenance metrics.
And to me, I'm sorry, in response, I feel that if we're simply maintaining without paying attention to it, then we're going to fall behind. Because you're always moving forward. A body in motion tends to stay in motion.
So that would be speaking to keeping some metrics in there, even if
Some,
they're not the focus.
But lower level, they don't have to be those deep,
Yeah.
resounding, but just let us know that we're maintaining and continuing to grow and learn in a reasonable manner. That's not that deep focus manner, right? Does that make sense?
Well, I think too, the other thing is that, so right now, the elementary principals are looking hard at end of year benchmark testing, SBA scores and things like that, right? So at a given level, we might have 85 kids pass the ELA exam at this point in time. There's 6 kids that haven't taken it yet, and, some other data that gets in there. But, who is that 15%? Well, that 15% really represents about 8 kids. So what are we doing for those 8 kids? Well, what we're trying to do is make sure that we're at least getting a year's growth out of those child, even if they're never going to meet the grade level benchmark that they're in. But that level of detail is different for each of the kids because of the way we're measuring growth. And so how do you report that out to the system? And maybe it's more about saying, we are doing this on a personal level. For this set of students, these are the interventions that we're using, and obviously can't use names or anything like that. And then but to know that even though the number is maintaining, we are still moving the system of kids along.
And then you see numbers with those kids pulled out too, the ones that are actually getting individual goals.
Which
Are
may
they-
be the way to do it, right?
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, those
It's
are like.
It's kind of the systemness that we've been talking about. So when you have just a small number of students, so how are we personalizing the learning within the system that we've built across the district that is how Fred and I have analyzed our work with our instructional leadership team for next year is we've got some systems that need to be shored up and they need to be layered on each other, which is the multi-tiered system of support concept that includes response to intervention for academics, includes positive behavior information, supports for kids for the social and emotional, because guess what? Without that component, the learning component doesn't work. So it totally explains why the fundamentals have evolved the way they have, because we know that you need all of those components for students to be successful. It does become tricky with metrics, but a metric could be, here's a system we've put in place for that 15% that haven't achieved within the response to intervention. Here's what tier 2, here's how many kids are tier 2, here's how many are in tier 3, and maybe 3, what the systems are doing to support students. And it, yeah, are they having
Harriet, when we're making these notes, it's kind of a takeaway, as I understand. What I'm hearing from Donna is the SIP, the SIPs are being kind of developed for next year, and you've informed your principals that social emotional is a good thing. What would be helpful is with these takeaways, I think if you also embedded our first exercise where we showed what we thought had the most opportunity for growth, where I think social emotional raised pretty darn high, is what I'd want, what I'd like is for your instruction that you've just told us to be somewhat reflective of the board's input we've given you. Does that make sense?
It does. So I have a question. Trying to make sure I understand these. I've heard focus a lot this afternoon, but I don't see it up there. So I'm curious about whether that's part of superintendent interpretation or not, or if that's, or how you feel about the idea of some focus areas.
I think school
also-
improvement plans would be
Pardon?
focus areas. The SIPs, the school
Okay, so
improvement.
let me continue my question because it's going back. So one of the things I would wonder about is you have school improvement plans and whether and how they reflect a district set of focus areas such as social emotional learning, or whether you expect that they will be so autonomous that they may have very different focus areas. And in that, then I would wonder about how, as a system, you prioritize professional development systems in order to support that. So these are all the questions that are running through my mind when it comes to focus, SIPs, district focus areas, and then the next one, the growth goals. So
Well,
I didn't know if that's maybe what you meant by superintendent interpretation, because
that's what I thought it meant.
okay, well then,
Because what I'm hearing
that's what's
is,
important.
what I'm hearing is our superintendent saying, there is so much breadth in all these fundamentals. I can't move the needle on all of them. We need to have some sort of focus. And so I think we've got two opportunities. One is we say, do the fundamentals, and then we create a separate list of, this is where we'd like you to emphasize your work for the next year or two or whatever. Or we just do, allow the superintendent to put their focus into their interpretation. So I think there's two options for the superintendent to consider. One is just do the fundamentals that the way we're doing, and then also have a short-term plan, or morph the fundamentals into your focus using your interpretation.
I'm concerned that instead of making things more streamlined, that's adding more. When I was hearing focus, I feel a little bit differently about what I think needs to be reported on the fundamentals. I don't need to hear, I trust that people are doing their job, and I think that if they're not, these things come to light pretty quickly. I don't worry about losing ground in standards, maintaining high standards, because the community is not going to let that happen. Our students aren't going to let that happen, and we're going to hear about it if they've got concerns. We're going to know it because test scores are going to drop off, or because AP, or honors classes, the number of kids enrolled. People at the school level, they're going to see it really quickly. And I'm not saying it's never reported, but if we're asking our leadership team to dive deep for reporting, we're gonna need to have areas of focus that we want to hear about, and they can't do all of it. I mean, and we don't, I mean, I think that's what we're hearing, is we don't necessarily want them to do all of it, but it doesn't mean that they're not doing the other aspects of their job.
So that's why we've said, roll back and take back some of the metrics. And we're not gonna monitor everything. You know, we're gonna roll some back, and the superintendent's interpretation allows the superintendent to put on her focus on that fundamental. Just because there's verbiage in that interpretation that's specific and focused, it doesn't mean everything else in that fundamental is being left. It allows you to put your fingerprint on it. It allows you to kind of look at what the board was putting an emphasis. So I think it gives our superintendent a lot of feedback, as well as her ability to put her stamp on it. And then I would imagine the administration can also propose some new metrics for that new focus. So that's where I was thinking we're going. Is that consistent with you, or
I don't
not so
know,
much?
maybe. I mean, I think I need to see, I mean, I think it's a little bit too abstract for me at this point.
I'm gonna put this into a slightly nuanced framing here. As you're talking and I'm listening, if you change the fundamentals and took out the verbs, meaning this is really your picture of your vision. So if you imagine that students are thriving in a cognitive, global, and digital world, this is a picture of what that looks like. This is what we see going on in the classroom. This is what we have personalized learning environments. The standards are high. There's self-awareness. So if you think about the fundamentals as your North Star, this is our ideal. This is what we expect because we are a high-achieving district of excellence and opportunity, right? And then as a board, you are constantly checking in to see where we are in terms of meeting that vision. Visions are always sweet, right? And at the same time, you have strategies that are in play or goals that are in play to reach that. That's the superintendent's interpretation. That's where you get the growth goals and your SMART goals and you're checking in and you're monitoring and your 1 and 3 and 5 year, where everybody knows these are the 3 really important things we're working on. Social and emotional health, we're working on some level of rigor and whatever it is, right? So that every teacher in your district knows exactly what's expected, and that every school improvement plan has some iteration of that, so that you've got that. And as a board, you're measuring the whole system. You don't need to be measuring the school because you know that all of this. So if you look at these as your North Star, and you look at this is how we get there, then it allows you to establish priorities. It allows PD, professional development, to be able to move on those priorities. And it helps the district, everybody kind of knows what's going on. So that's kind of what I'm pulling away from our conversation right now.
I think, just after listening to Deborah and even my own superintendent, maybe it's the word interpretation. Maybe that's the word that is.
I think that's what we have on our monitoring sheets, right?
Right.
Maybe superintendent's action.
Right,
Maybe not
and then that way
action.
it gives it sometimes an annual, right? So, you know, for the superintendent action for 18-19, we're going to be focused on, Fred, I'm just throwing this out there, don't panic.
I'm writing this down. Here's my workload next year.
Working with professional development to shore up our systems with multi-tiered systems of support in these areas. And because the work is, for much of this, going to occur with learning services, because that's the work, you know, that we do. We have to be able to say, and here's how we're going to pay for it. Here's how the budget's going to support it, because that's really important for the work that the board does as well, that we're, you know, fiscally responsible. So maybe it's that word interpretation. I have to say, it has kind of always bothered me a little bit as to you know, I think, Ralph, you and I talked about it at one point too, because you said, did we plagiarize? Like, this says it comes from here, right? And we don't. And I was like, well, certainly there's lots of words here, but if it's an action and it's going to change perhaps each year, right? When we're talking about student growth and student achievement and impacting student achievement, some of these could have could evolve each year because we're going to set a marker, a metric that now we need to maintain, so it's going to change for them.
Maybe it's an annual focus.
Yeah.
Is there an annual focus on each of the fundamentals?
If the superintendent thinks it's important. And I think the
Based on
focus.
blank.
Well,
That's
I don't know if you want to say, I don't know if you want to say each one of these focuses is an annual. It might, I think it's a continuous action. Because some of them are going to be a 6-month plan, some are going to be a 5-year plan. And I don't think you want to get into making all these plans last a certain amount of time.
Well, taking the example, Donna, that you provided, and I'm on board with that one, talking about the MTSS. That one in and of itself probably touches all 7 of these. But what we can do is report back to you on the progress on developing MTSS and weave in how this is achieving. I mean, that's going to touch all of those in that instance. There might be another priority that only hits a couple, but we could really show you how we're moving the mark. It's kind of taking the middle ground of the incremental growth versus shying away from making sure we're setting all these benchmarks, but it's really the middle of that saying, yeah, we'll maintain, the other things will be maintained. The community's going to require that of us. Even more than that, I think we've got a bunch of leaders and teachers and staff members in this district that expect that of themselves. But now we prioritize a few of them with some metrics that say, where are we trying to move the needle? And then if we do it, great, how do we systematize that so that it becomes maintenance? If it's not, we need to tack in a different direction and do something differently, but along the way.
I wonder if we're looking at it backwards. I'm just throwing this out there. I don't know exactly how I think about it, but something that you said just kind of made me think of this. If we take, whatever your focus, advisory, action, whatever it is, and those are reported on how they impact each fundamental. So we're actually looking at things that are happening in the district and making sure that they align with our fundamentals. And that way, like Fred said, if it's whatever the number, the initials are you said, if those are going to touch on every fundamental, then that's part of the report is here's our action item for this, here's one of our action items. And then, throughout the year as we're looking at compliance, or when we're looking at, instead of going fundamental, 1, 2, and then however the numbers split out, at this meeting, we're gonna be looking at these action items. And then, this other meeting, 2 months later, we're gonna be looking at these action items. And then, how do these action items, number 1, impact our students in the classroom? And then also, are they in line with our vision? To me, that's much more concrete. I think that's the struggle I've had, is I want to see examples. I mean, I'm not a verbal learner. I want to see things happening. And it doesn't mean everything has to be successful. I mean, if something tries and it's not successful, that's okay.
You're coming up on 3 o'clock.
Hey, it's not just. So where do you want to go? I think the next, this is my timer, I keep setting another 5 minutes away.
I think we've had a good conversation about this. I think the superintendent's had a good opportunity to hear all of us. I think ultimately it's your work that you're gonna have to do, whether it's the superintendent's action or stuff. So I think you need to get vested in this, and you need to tell us what you've heard from this in general.
I think this gives us a really good springboard for our retreat in June. Thankfully at the end of June, so it gives our staff some time to kind of reflect and look at current structure and how could that evolve into actionable, what's the right word, how can we attack this to make it manageable work but impactful work, so that it really is going to impact students in the classroom. And then when we come back to the retreat in June, we'll be able to discuss with some thought, what are some things that we think we can tackle next year, as well as within in the retreat. It's the whole piece of how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. So it might be, we might, and I totally admit this, I have certainly set lofty goals, and then at the midway point said, we're not going to make that one now, but we are going to see this one. So, it's that, here's what we think we can manage, here's what we can work through next year, and have that conversation in June and set the course and some direction for you as a board as we have some time to think about it. Look at different structures. Yeah,
So, there's what I'm hearing, is that at the retreat, we will bring back a set of recommendations for the board, and kind of, that you and the staff will work on between now and then, and taking into account this conversation and how you'd like to move forward. Am I accurate?
It is, but I want to make sure everybody else is in agreement with around the room here. or at least hear people's different opinions on this thing.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, are we going to get school improvement plans at the retreat time? Is that the intent?
No.
Or are you thinking about a revitalization of the fundamentals? So I think kind of what we've kind of given some direction towards is, we're open to reinvigorating the fundamentals in some fashion. We're open to metric updates around the fundamentals as in terms of reduction and some characteristic of maintaining it. And then we're open to superintendent action items where you think are learning and improvements we need to bring to the system that are, I'll use bold and audacious, that may take anywhere from 6 months to 5-year horizons, that you think are meaningful, important, and necessary for our kids, right? And maybe that might be an interesting level to come back to from the superintendent. I guess I can understand that there's a problem on the other side for a superintendent to get too vested in an action and then the board to say, well, that's not what I meant this, because we haven't done that once today, have we? So I can kind of get that. So maybe those things might be interesting, that allow the board then to give feedback around something more concrete. I appreciate we have not been super concrete here. I appreciate we put a lot on your lap. But I think that's kind of where it should be. We kind of, I think as a board, I think we've talked about putting this in the hands of experts. And then there's a great deal of flexibility on your side, but I think on the other end, we do want the board to remain an oversight board. Trust is good, but too much trust but verify, is that the operational term? So I think that's kind of where we want to be, and I think we'll give it at your discretion to come back with some suggestions around that meaningfully reduce the workload in preparing these and in staff workload, that type of thing. Is that a good for June timeframe? Any other opinions?
Brian?
I would, using I statements, I think this has been great work. We've got a sense for each other and where you are right now. So what I would like to see at the next, what I would be happy to see is your recommendations, sort of how to move forward. Just some, and not big, solid, grand plans, but what's going to work for you? And how are you going to make this your district as a superintendent? How can we support that in policy is what I would like to do.
And let me, I think there could be two interpretations, Donna. One is when you come back, that it's, yes, I like the idea of the superintendent's action plan on each one of these. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is, here is my concrete action plan already filled out. And so there's two different expectations, and we need to decide which one it is. To me, it's just the general format of the action plan and your buy-in or interest in that thing. Is that the same? Tracy?
Yeah, from what I'm understanding,
And I'm just wondering, just throwing this, I agree, and is our student board reps going to be chosen this spring or not till fall?
We're in the process right now, so we should know who the student will be, but our procedure says that students will only participate in board meetings during the school year.
Okay,
So
so
the
I was
first
just thinking that
meeting is in
to
September.
hear student voice might.
This is a joke. This is a joke. There, isn't it all 5 of our children are going to be in the... It's an inside joke, but you'd have to watch the last meeting.
I think some of that voice is going to be coming out next year as we work with a student advisory, a student rep to the board. And there's a lot of the pieces that you've talked about that we've already put into a planning mode for next year as well anyways, in how to make sure that we're hearing the voice more of teachers and having that input be heard in our committees, for example, and how to work with some of those pieces. So those very likely will be parts of some of this work that we do to bring our thoughts to EG.
So we'll be talking more about the work will actually be done next year.
Yes.
So I think we're all in agreement of our expectation. Is that what you want to do? Or is this not what you want to do come in the next workshop?
No, that's where we wanted to get for June is what's going to be the work for 18-19 with the board knowing the direction that the board wants to go as a whole. The only thing I would just clarify for Brian is he said your vision. I always look at it as a team. It's our schools, our district, our team, our kids, our vision.
I was thinking of the process.